Hello, everyone. Welcome to the University of Pittsburgh Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. The center is running a spring series of seminars titled Race in Focus, from critical pedagogies to research practice and public engagement in Slavic, East European, and Eurasian studies. There are 4 sessions this spring. It started on February 5th with Russian literature in the 19th and 20th centuries. Today, we have a panel consisting of anthropologists working on the issues of race, gender, and indigeneity in the American Arctic and Siberia. There are 2 more sessions talking about whiteness and Black Lives Matter reception in Eastern Europe, Russia, and Central Asia for the rest of February. My name is Manduhai Boyandelger, and I'm a faculty in anthropology department at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I work on post-socialist Mongolia on the issues of religion, politics, gender, and decolonialism. It is a great pleasure to be the moderator for this fabulous panel. 2 fellow anthropologists are joining me today. Professor Olga Ulturgasheva from University of Manchester and Professor Catherine Graeber from Indiana University, Bloomington. The session of the day is titled Race, Gender, and Indigeneity in the American Arctic and Siberia. So we will have 2 presentations and then Q&A. Now I'm going to turn to my colleagues, Olga first and then Catherine, to introduce themselves. And then after that, we will begin the presentations.
Good evening and good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Olga Ulturgasheva. It's my great pleasure to be here. I am an anthropologist based at the University of Manchester. My recent research has been focusing on climate change, environment, indigenous issues, and adaptation strategies across Arctic and also in comparative connections to the China. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Catherine.
Hi, thanks so much for having me today. My name is Kate Graeber, or Catherine Graeber. I'm an assistant professor of anthropology and Central Eurasian Studies at Indiana University, Bloomington. I'm a linguistic and sociocultural anthropologist. So I'm currently working on issues in the Mongolian cashmere industry, actually, closer to Manduhai's work. But in the past, I've worked since 2005 on issues of language and media, especially minoritized media. Minority language media in Buryatia, and that's what I'll be talking about today.
Fabulous. Before we begin our presentations, I also want to thank our staff at the who've prepared for us technologically and logistically for the seminar, University of Pittsburgh Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, specifically Susanna Magdo. So thank you so much for organizing this. It's been a lot of work, and it's just such a pleasure to be with such an inspiring and exciting audience. So our first presenter is Olga. So if you would like to start, I think we are all set to engage with your work.
Yes, thank you so much, Manduhai. Good evening, everyone. And I also would like to thank Zhuzha for kind invitation to participate in this fascinating series focusing on race. And it's my huge honor and pleasure to present today next to brilliant colleagues, anthropologists, Dr. Catherine Graeber and Manduhai. Congratulations, Manduhai, with your promotion to full professorship. This is brilliant news and excellent beginning to this session in particular. So, and I would like to start my paper, which is titled Gender, Environment, and the Fourth World, in the accounts of the 3 indigenous women in Siberia and Alaska. Open pit mining sites are often located in the globe's most vulnerable area, including most research-rich regions such as Alaska and Siberia, which are the homelands of small-scale Aboriginal societies or the people of the Fourth World. While contaminating lands and human and non-human bodies, extractive industries operating in these two Fourth World regions are generously subsidized by governments and corporations. Intensive mining of subsurface resources in combination with such environmental calamities as wildfires and floods caused by disappearing sea ice rapidly transform these areas into ecological ruins. If we look at the 2020 summer reports on Alaskan and Siberian wildfires, systemic impact of permafrost melt and COVID pandemic on the top of all of these, we can speak of severe propagation of risks across the Russian and American Arctic, making already fragile environments even more fragile and turning the Arctic region into a hotspot for emergencies. Melting Arctic cryosphere increases the likelihood for thousands of the villages and towns located along the Arctic coastline, and these are mainly areas populated by the Arctic indigenous communities, to be threatened by storms and rapidly rising sea levels. The communities have been ceaselessly calling for international attention to the environmental destruction caused by mining corporations, while articulating their life and death situations from within a semantic field of indigeneity. For marginalized societies of the Fourth World, indigeneity has been and still is the only political category with which they can and are allowed to negotiate their lives, and the only political resource that serves as the basis from which one might be able to make claims. Therefore, it has profound social and political implications for the Fourth World people's survival and security. It's important to recognize the context in which the category of indigeneity is politically important, that in order to be heard, you need to claim who you are. And this is the kind of experience, subjectivity, and voice that has been historically suppressed, silenced, and erased from the conversation. Given how important it is in certain life and death situations, indigeneity, if used in other contexts, could be employed in mutually confusing, sometimes eliding, overlapping, and occasionally contradictory ways. It is often accused by anthropologists working in the third world contexts for being reductive and obscuring, and it is frequently being dismissed and diminished by its critics down to an expression of nativism, an intense hostility to anything deemed alien and threatening to national cohesion. Since the rhetoric of nativism is often utilized by radical right-wing neo-nationalist political parties that have gained popularity among dominant colonial and ethnic majorities across the world, the comparison of the political struggle of small-scale Aboriginal societies with dominant neo-colonial political forces is at best ill-judged and erroneous, and at worst intentionally reproductive of the colonial racist regime of dispossession and subjugation of indigenous sovereignties, as well as blocking decolonizing initiatives on the ground. In academic non-indigenous discourses, the indigenous voice, when it comes to any form of collective representation, is often judged as essentialist. This type of treatment of indigeneity often originates from considerations of the third world contexts, with highly territorialized configurations of identity politics, for which anything indigenous would be indeed reductive and not accurate. What connects the third world and fourth worlds is a common experience of colonialism. What distinguishes the third and fourth worlds is that the fourth world peoples would never be able to hope to govern the nations they host, while third world peoples are nations themselves and have governments and parliaments. Moreover, the third world has the status to react to geopolitical dynamic and pivot its expanding influence between the superpowers. The distinction between two worlds is political, religious, and economic. In this sense, the fourth world, coined by Manuel Castells and developed further by a Canadian First Nations scholar, George Manuel, reflects a geopolitical layout of the colonized populations and refers particularly to the Aboriginal societies strategically excluded from the access to control and distribution of the flows of capital and meaning. For racial minorities, people of color who identify themselves, their families, and their communities as indigenous, indigeneity signifies recognition of continuities, such as their intimate relations to ancestral lands, language, heritage, as well as colonial history of dispossession and genocide. Candice Callison, an anthropologist and member of Canadian Tahltan Nation, relevantly highlights that the need for political representation of Indigenous populations in the global political arena has been shaped in response to colonial extraction of natural resources and industrial destruction of their traditional lands. In her book, How Climate Comes to Matter, Callison raises important issues of representation in the epistemological dimension of media reports on climate change. One of the points stressed by her is that in the era of dramatic climate change and environmental transformation, lobbying by Indigenous public organizations has been critical in forming a political response to industrialization and militarization of the Arctic. For example, the Inuit Circumpolar Conference, ICC, became a vital political platform representing Inuit needs and priorities in global and domestic political regimes. Their political interventions aim to ensure that governments and their policies are held accountable for the decisions they make that affect Inuit people across the Arctic. Inuit concerns are as much about their embodied connection to the ancestral lands as they are about environmental sustainability and security in the region. So this paper is an attempt to unpack what sort of experiences and positions indigeneity misrepresents and obscures, to what extent it is reductive, and what is being obscured when people use the term to articulate their positions while negotiating acute political, environmental, life and death issues. My entry point for understanding the implications of the latest environmental changes on the lives and experiences of Indigenous populations is the stories of 3 Indigenous women who find themselves in the middle of intensive resource extraction-based development in northeast part of Yakutia, which is Siberia, and northern Alaska. Although these 3 women are Indigenous, we shall see that their stories highlight quite distinct and complex set of issues. 2 women are Indigenous Siberians, and I'll start with them and then move to a story of Native Alaskan woman. First, let me introduce where I actually show you guys where the actual Republic of Yakutia is. Here you can actually see the map, and here I'm talking about this particular region of Siberia. So around this area, so it's subarctic Siberia. So the region these 2 Siberian women come from is called Republic of Sakha-Yakutia. It occupies an area roughly the size of India. Its population, however, is no more than 1 million. According to the latest census, the Sakha account for 50% of the Republic's total population, which is the largest ethnic group of the region, followed by 37% of Russians. The territory of Yakutia is extremely rich in natural resources. It has the 2nd largest diamond industry in the world, and also produces large quantities of gold, silver, and other mineral resources. During the Soviet period, virtually all of the Republic's industries were subjected to control by the Central Soviet State Planning Commission. However, following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the Sakha parliament, Iltumen, placed all of the Republic's industries, including the extractive industry, under its jurisdiction. By doing so, Sakha affirmed Republican sovereignty to provide an opportunity to extract and trade mineral resources from the territory of the Republic. Although Sakha held an official status of a title, also called titular nation, with its own administration and government since the Soviet period, they recently insisted on affirming the status of indigenous. And in 2016, the Iltumen proclaimed Sakha indigenous. Sakha are relatively new to this region, where they believed to have moved from southern Siberia during the 13th century. The numerically small peoples of the north, these are Aveni, Yukagir, Evenki, and Chukchi, are considered the aboriginal or endogenous minorities, who make up only 3% of the entire population. The societies to which two women under the question belong differ ethnically, linguistically, and culturally, in their social and political organization, and in their type of land use. Eveni are reindeer herders, while Sakha are agriculturalists and cow and horse breeders. They hold distinctive positions within the contemporary ethnoscape of the Russian Federation. In short, I find my former PhD supervisor, a prominent anthropologist of India and Siberia, Pius Vitebsky's comparison of Sakha with Hindu and Aveni with Adivasi, crude yet quite eloquent in showing the position of each in the socioeconomic and ethnic hierarchy. Rather than making these two women icons of indigeneity, I would like to emphasize the extent to which people who have been held in distinct socioeconomic and political positions are pushed to find their contrasting voices within one umbrella category of indigeneity. The stories of both women revolve around environmental situation in the vicinity of a small community of Aveni reindeer herders and the area of their reindeer pastures, located right in the middle of the richest silver deposits in Siberia. The area is located about 600 miles away from the city of Yakutsk, the capital of the Republic. Here, silver is being extracted by a mining company, Polus, owned by Russian oligarchs and run jointly by Russian and Sakha administrators. It is also a subsidiary company of the Golden Wolf Resources, a Canadian investment corporation with the headquarters in London and Toronto, and corporate bank accounts registered on the British Channel Island of Jersey. Polus conducts open pit silver mining in this area, generating a large amount of waste and toxic dust affecting the air and water chemistry. The staggering ecological devastation continues since 2017 and is largely due to cyanide used for the silver processing and production. All of this pose major health concerns and security threat for the community of Aveni reindeer herders and all surrounding flora and fauna. So let me move to the story of Lana. The story of an indigenous woman, Lana, the director of the silver mining company Polus, sponsored by the Canadian corporation Golden Wolf Resources, can challenge everything you know about indigenous environmentalism and illustrates an eloquent example of a pro-capitalist entrepreneurship that strategically plays an indigenous card to advance for-profit agendas. In 2017, she became a general director of a mining project to install silver mining infrastructure in the region. This project has been within President Putin's top priorities, centered on expansion of extraction of mineral resources across Russian Arctic. Lana is an urban woman who comes from a wealthy Sakha family with connections in influential Moscow circles. Her career received boost when Sakha economic and political elites based in Moscow promoted centralization of revenues, privatization of mining companies, and the entry of big corporations owned and run by Russian oligarchs on the territory of the Republic. Unsurprisingly, President Putin attended an online ceremony of the opening ceremony of the company's main silver mining site in September 2019, during which he congratulated Lana personally. A lawyer by training, she has been employed by the company since 2013, when the company received a 20-year mining license to the richest deposit located in the reindeer herding area. Since the company active extraction of silver in April 2017, the company sold a total of 1.6 million ounces of silver, totaling production revenue of $29 million. The company led by Lana actively propagates a myth that given the director of the company is indigenous, the company cares about indigenous population of the area, and that the silver extraction, land-based subsistence economies, and wildlife can coexist sustainably. Here, one cannot resist a reference to Arnott Singh's account of the frontier scenario of spectacular accumulation that shares most characteristics of the polis operations, namely immoral opportunism and predatory exploitation. Except this time, maximization of the profit and rapid accumulation of the capital are conducted with assistance from new type of indigenous entrepreneurs like this woman. Lana is well placed among the agents of exploitation and capitalist profit-making, and her position is constituted by the Sakha indigenous bourgeoisie, whose creation as a class has been made possible by the context, pressures, and interests of the nouveau-riche circles in the larger society. On the one hand, holding all important positions in the regional bureaucracy to control the flows is an agenda of highest priority for Sakha bureaucrats. On the other hand, their political and economic dominance entails quite an uneasy relationship with the status of indigenous. It is not surprising to see how Sakha bureaucrats tend to despise and are often hostile to the outset concerns about the Aboriginal minorities, because for Sakha, these groups constitute unwarranted meddling with their own political and economic agendas, aimed at consolidation of their political authority, especially control over economic resources. Hence, in order to maintain control of the capital distribution, it is in the interests of Sakha elites to ensure other small-numbered indigenous minorities are underrepresented and actively excluded from any form of legal and political representation. For a capitalist neoliberal entrepreneur like Lana, indigeneity is a convenient political card that she is effectively using as a symbol of corporate social responsibility. Serving as an agent of a mining industry, she moves quite wittingly between various positions, looking for political opportunities in a sector of corporate social responsibility while profiting from extraction of silver. Polis is presented in her speeches as a company with high environmental standards, which is specially praised by Putin's government for its ability to attract highly qualified labor from around Russia and environmentally responsible management. Lana is playing the indigeneity card at the same time as she is aspiring to join a class of Russian oligarchs in Moscow. Now I move to the story of the Havana woman, Uyandina. Her story is an account of her continuous effort to defend the land and river contaminated by the silver mining company, directed by Lana. Uyandina comes from a local family of reindeer herders. She grew up in her parents' reindeer herding camp, and she spent almost entire life in her native community, which she only left to get a degree at the Yakutsk University in the early 90s. After graduation from the university, she joined her family, moving along the seasonal pastures. After marrying a local Havana man and having 3 children, she worked in the capacity of a teacher at the local school, and lately decided to become a head of the reindeer herding commune, in Russian called Община, which she organized together with her husband and 2 sons. And this is the point in her life when she got into an open opposition and protest against the silver mining company over the issue of toxic contamination of the river along which her family move and reindeer graze. Together with Uyandina, local residents fear that mining development would turn their lands into ecological ruins. The construction of silver mining infrastructure involved several roads used for transportation of fuels and lubricants, and several excavation sites, which now pollute the land with chemicals. Uyandina informed that during the fall last year and winter this year, in the area surrounding the mining operation, reindeer herders noticed that a number of locations with fuel spills is increasing. And in addition to an already polluted river, 2 other rivers with vital fresh waters had turned into unusable and undrinkable mud. Community members led by Uyandina expressed concerns about the loss of high-quality reindeer pastures, contamination of water and land by toxic materials, in the letter openly addressed to President Putin. While highlighting the health and security risks caused by the extractive activity, she wrote, quote, "We Aveni, the indigenous people of this region, fear about safety of our children, rivers, land and reindeer, upon which our entire lives depend. Unlike Lana, Uyandina has got no space for playing several political cards and has no choice but to invoke her indigeneity. In her statement, she is not so much concerned about the status of being indigenous. Her concerns are centered on the river, land, and reindeer, without which her people's entire survival is undermined." In my conversation with Uyandina, she stated this poetically in Avena language. Oran acha, even acha, oran bidin, even bidin. In translation, if reindeer are gone, Avena are gone. If reindeer are safe, Avena are safe too. By stating this, she emphatically emphasizes how vital is the human-reindeer connection for the survival of the Avena. Her political call that lies at the intersections of gender, environment, and indigeneity exceeds humanocentric politics. This resonates with what Marisol de la Cadena, with Marisol de la Cadena's point on cosmopolitics, indigenous politics, which transcends or exceeds the boundaries of mainstream politics as an exclusively human domain from which non-human forces are banned. Since Uyandina has received no response to her letter from Putin and no response in action came from Sakha authorities, she traveled to a district center and stood outside of the district administration with a placard with a statement, "Stop mining, stop polluting our land," for several days, until the police removed and fined her for an unauthorized picket. It is clear that Uyandina's cosmopolitical stance has denied, elided, and even received with hostility by the mainstream politics, as it clashed with the authorities' more urgent concerns pertaining to their profit-making agendas. Moreover, Uyandina's taking a lead in an attempt to fight against destruction of fragile ecosystem of reindeer pastures constitutes an expression of a gendered shift in labor and political activism. If in the Soviet time, Avena reindeer herders were socialist proletariat supported by the state pursuing its agenda to turn them into industrial workers of the socialist meat production sector, in the post-Soviet time, Avena reindeer herders were quickly transformed from socialist proletariat into an abandoned, disinvested proletariat whose socioeconomic situation severely declined with the highest rate of unemployment and social suffering over the last 2 decades. But what is happening now is unprecedented. Quite likely they face the most brutal and harshest environmental threat in the entire history. Although the collapse of the Soviet state and withdrawal of the Soviet support from this area has had a distressing impact on the socioeconomic conditions of indigenous reindeer herders and hunters, The scale of environmental devastation caused by the extractive activity of the silver mining company, which started only 2 years ago, has now exceeded the decades of degradation wrought by Soviet development project. Since the company began open pit mining, the number of domestic reindeer has dramatically reduced from 17,000 to a catastrophic 6,000. Currently, there is no enough reindeer to organize annual slaughter to meet the community's everyday needs. The occupation of a reindeer herder hardly provides anything to meet individual and family needs. Therefore, the only option available for men is to survive and provide for their families by seeking employment as workers at various sites of mining companies, which over the last 5 years popped up like mushrooms. Since the organization of migrant labor is quite costly, these companies, including Polus, are constantly looking for local labor force, which is always cheaper and available. Local men opt for mining out of hardship, desperate poverty, and no prospects for jobs. While the community loses a significant portion of their active male labor force to the mining companies, men pay the double price of a shift worker with periodic and often prolonged absences from their families and children, and suffer from uncertainty about the future. Since men have no choice but to join the mining sector around the region, it is women who take a lead in standing against the mining company, laying waste to their lands. The highly visible leadership role played by indigenous women like Uyandina is striking because despite Soviet ideology of gender equality, the exercise of power remained fundamentally patriarchal. The opposition and protest against Polus reveal the prominence of indigenous women and shift in gender roles. Uyandina found a new purpose in leading the protest, taking seriously her eldest charge to carry responsibility for her land and people. She became a matriarch as she mobilized others. To a certain extent, Uyandina's story reflects a recent gender shift and exemplifies the leading role indigenous women take in caring for their lands, reindeer, and people. So in other parts of the Arctic, right across the Bering Strait, and you can actually see on this on the map, this is territory of Siberia, just across the Bering Strait, and we already here in Alaska. And this is the barrow, community barrow that I'm going to talk about now. So
we are a little pressed this time, so if you could talk quickly, that would be much appreciated.
Oh, sorry, yeah, just very quickly, actually, I'm almost finishing.
Yeah. Thank you.
So in the Alaska northernmost community of Barrow, which has been homeland for Inupiat whalers for 1,000 years, we observe quite distinct yet familiar dynamic where the futures of indigenous subsistence economies and the futures of non-renewable resource development are bitterly contested within families and local institutions. Although there are drastic differences in economic and political history of Alaska and Siberia, as well as distinct social organization and subsistence practices, the divergent socioeconomic and political processes generate similar power tensions over the question who controls the major decisions being made about the land and silver, as in the case of Avena and Sahar, and ocean oil, as in the case of Inupiat. Oops, oh, sorry, yeah. Here I would like to present the story of Rachel, a young Inupiat oral historian, a filmmaker from Barrow, whose voice I find particularly relevant for Uyandina's case, not only because they are both concerned about futures and security of their native lands, but because Rachel's story further complicates the picture in which indigeneity and environmental security intersect. A granddaughter of prominent Barrow whaling captain, she spent all her adult life in film and education industries, and has been attempting with some success to avoid politics. However, this has been increasingly less of an option as the environmental and political issues Inupiat face currently pose unprecedented threat. In the early 70s, Inupiat were actively trying to navigate the lasting impacts of colonization. This was also the time when young Inupiat leaders were filing land claims. And for those who are not familiar with Inupiat history, these land claims represented a direct threat to the United States economic control of mineral-rich Alaska. In response to the United States federal government, without the approval or agreement of the tribal government, created the for-profit Inupiat and owned and run Arctic Slope Regional Corporation, or ASRC for short. And despite protests from tribal governments, the United States assigned ASRC the control of the vast majority of the Inupiat tribal lands. Rachel states that the reason for US federal government forced a corporate for-profit onto our people was to bring about conflict inside our community. Their stated intention was to destroy Native solidarity and inspire individual ownership. This was the only way to gain control of the contested mineral-rich land base that is Alaska Native lands. From 80s and further on, the ASRC pushed for offshore oil development. It went on to become one of the richest Alaskan corporations, with $3.4 billion in annual revenue, with profits mostly reaped from oil. As the ASRC became the Alaska proudest Indigenous success story, it also exacerbated relations within the community, having divided the Inupiat into pro-oil Inupiat and those like Rachel, pro-whale. All of these changes are fracturing the Inupiat forms of communal decision-making, while undermining the future of Inupiat traditional whaling and driving environmental degradation. For Inupiat like Rachel, the intergenerational connection between Inupiat and whales cannot cease. Just like reindeer for Avene, whales remain to be the center of Inupiat's social universe. So Rachel is openly opposing the oil-centered development in Barrow, and is problematizing the system that destroys and disrupts Inupiat life ways. The Inupiat case shows that the workings of the corporate system that is primarily governed by the profit-driven interests, even if the corporation becomes indigenous and is run by indigenous shareholders, the corporate system with its short-term planning and narrow consumerist vision would always ensure that Inupiat knowledge is not recognized, their needs are not important, and the national interests in extractive industry are more important than local needs in subsistence economies. All three cases that I presented are quite complex and do not provide single and straightforward answers. But what they show is that any analytical angle on indigeneity should resist its treatment from within singular monolithic lens. To have a complex understanding of indigeneity, it is critical to situate it at the intersections of diverse configurations of power relations, including regimes of dispossession and neo-colonial strategies of disempowerment. In Sahara woman case, the problem of concentration of wealth and power among the elite, with consequent impoverishment of small-numbered peoples in the remote Siberian Arctic, is obscured by the claims of indigeneity. They are clearly not about.
I think we won't have time for Catherine, so I think you can probably address what is left in the Q&A.
Okay.
Yeah,
that's fine. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
apologies. Yeah.
Catherine?
Stop share. Yeah.
Fascinating, though. I want to hear the completion of that thought in the middle of that sentence that you were in. It's an honor to present after Olga today, and I think you're going to see a lot of points of convergence actually in our material, even though we're talking about quite different parts of Russia, and some of the points of contrast between our two presentations today are exactly some of the arguments that we're, I think, working toward here. So I'll try to share my screen. So I'd like to thank Zsuzsa Magdo for inviting me to participate in this roundtable and Manduhai for moderating our discussion, as well as ACES and all the area studies centers who are co-sponsoring this important series. I've been following the Race in Focus series with great interest, and I'm really grateful for all the ideas that other speakers in previous sessions have presented for how to teach about race and racialization in the region and how to build those comparative connections between understanding race and racialization in Russia, Eastern Europe, and Eurasia on the one hand, and the US on the other, that we've often lacked. That hasn't been easy to do often. So I'm going to start, I'm going to start with a map. There we go. I'm going to draw today on ethnographic material from the Buryat territories of Russia as examples of how we might advance a comparative approach to racialization and indigenous studies, following very much on many of the points that Olga has made actually too. So the Buryat territories lie on the Russian-Mongolian border in Asian Russia, about 3.5 days from Moscow by train, a very salient fact in many people's minds within Russia. They include the Republic of Buryatia, which is a semi-autonomous ethnic republic, and about 30% ethnically Buryat compared to the Sakha Republic that Olga just described as 50% ethnically Sakha, but that's the titular nationality. And also in two smaller territories, Aga and Ustorda, which were dissolved and merged into the surrounding Russian-dominated regions by administrative restructuring and federal recentralization during my research. I am not Buryat or Russian, a point to which I'll return. As a linguistic anthropologist, I came to Buryatia, or more accurately, I returned to Buryatia after having visited it there for different purposes, because I was interested in how in Buryatia, as in many other parts of the former Soviet Union and former socialist states, language has become the touchstone and often the battleground for much broader sociopolitical struggles. So Buryat has been the main criterion of ethno-national belonging in the Buryat territories, but the number of speakers and the percentage of ethnic Buryats reporting knowledge of Buryat has declined over 400 years of Russian contact, with an especially precipitous decline in the 2000s. So today there are 329,100 self-reported speakers based on census data, which has its own problems, but leave that aside for a second. About 329,000 self-reported speakers across Russia, Northern Mongolia, and the Shenzhen region of Inner Mongolia in the People's Republic of China. In the 2010 All Russia census, just about 219,000 people within the Russian Federation reported controlling Buryat. So the Buryat territories of Russia are very much the sort of homeland of this language, and that's often how people describe it actually, is as the homeland, or the Rodina in Russian. Within the Russian Federation, over the 2000s, the percentage of the total Buryat population who's reported knowledge of Buryat has declined from 72% to 45%. And within the Republic of Buryatia, that decline has been even, the shift has been even sharper, from 81% of the Republic's Buryat population reporting knowledge of Buryat in 2002 to 43% in the 2010 census. And the 2020 census will probably show another decline. So between 2005 and 2012, I collected ethnographic, sociolinguistic, and archival data on Buryat Russian language use and on the development, production, and consumption of local media across a range of platforms, including print, radio, television, and newer digital media. And then beyond that, I continued with some digital ethnography, because you never really leave your field site in 2021. So the collective results of that are published in my new book with Cornell University Press, but I don't intend this brief presentation as a book talk. Rather, I'm going to discuss how the categories and discourses of race and indigeneity are invoked, or rather not invoked explicitly in Asian Russia and especially in Buryatia, for some strategic reasons, actually, that Olga was pointing to as well. And then I'm going to draw out 3 vignettes from the book that highlight the racialized expectations of linguistic and cultural performance that are leveled at different actors, and that point to some ways in which I think we can advance decolonial perspectives in researching minoritized and marginalized groups, specifically Native and Indigenous peoples of Russia. So since I'll be talking about Buryatia today, let me wish you a happy Sagalgan, an opening of the white month. Sagan Harar, Sagalganar, Buryadar. That's a happy Buryat Lunar New Year, but happy Tsagansar and Losar and Chinese New Year today too. The coincidence that we're holding this roundtable on the opening of the white month bears on my topic today, in that the invocation of whiteness for purity in Buddhist and shamanic traditions, sweeping away blackness, would seem to match the semiotic binary of whiteness and blackness in racialized terms in the US. US. And there is something to this in that people in Russia frequently describe people with origins in the Caucasus, Central Asia, Africa, and sometimes Roma as well as Black. And they talk about becoming white people, bielые люди, when they're socioeconomically upwardly mobile and life is getting easier and better. But you can probably tell from that example that Blackness and whiteness as social categories are closely associated in Russian with labor and socioeconomic prospects, used in much the same way an American English speaker might distinguish between manual blue collar and white collar workers. In any case, the primary binary opposition in the part of Russia that I'm going to talk about today is between being racialized not as Black or white, but as Asian or as Slavic or European. Race isn't a category that people in Russia invoke explicitly very often. In fact, many people within Russia and some scholars who echo this line of thinking believe that Russian racism is definitionally impossible, so that it's sort of anachronistic or something to use the term to describe Russian social categories. And that attitude has a long history. It's rooted in a kind of Soviet exceptionalism. Soviet discourse during the Cold War held that racism was a problem of the capitalist West, particularly the United States. Soviet nationalities policies focused on mixing rather than segregation. And this is one of the things people will point to. For example, early Soviet biologists studied the physiological benefits of racial mixing in border republics like Buryatia, directly challenging Nazi race science in the 1930s. Linguists emphasized the mutual influence of languages on one another. And the state encouraged, maybe most importantly, the state encouraged extensive internal migration between far-flung parts of the Soviet Union and its brother republics. In the 1960s, large numbers of ethnic Russians and ethnic Ukrainians were encouraged to resettle in ethnic republics like Buryatia through intensive industrialization and labor incentives, and so on. So some of this, particularly, and I'm saying this all partly for people who don't work in Russia, as I understand there are a lot of people joining us today who work in other parts of the world and are curious to know more about the histories of these categories in this region. I mean, some of what I've just said, particularly resettling ethnic Russians and Ukrainians and Slavic peoples in ethnic republics, might sound a lot like colonialism. But indigenous peoples were supposed to have been liberated from Russian colonialism by Soviet socialism. So it was definitionally impossible for Soviet minorities to be colonial subjects. And this narrative has had remarkable staying power. It's prevented, in many cases, what could be a really robust discussion about how to articulate a post-colonial position and strategize. For some similar reasons, indigeneity is a fraught concept within Russia, and many Buryats have not taken up discourses of indigenous rights, even though doing so would likely benefit them in concrete financial and political ways. So elsewhere in the world, key goals of minority language media, and from my own research, have been language maintenance and revitalization, which in turn have been understood as issues of indigenous rights. Buryat speakers have not, however, generally taken up or benefited from the romantic rhetoric of indigenous language endangerment and death, often marshaled in defense of minority language speakers elsewhere, because indigenous rights are not the primary framework in which Buryat leaders and activists have asserted their language rights or their rights to political autonomy. So indigeneity is a vexing concept in Siberia. While there's no doubt that Imperial Russia colonized Buryatia, it's been difficult to locate Siberian nationalities within post-colonial discourse because it is neither clear, as I just mentioned, that the Soviet project constituted a form of imperialism, nor that there's anything post about it. This creates something of a rift in scholarship. So in the post-Soviet period in Buryatia, for instance, local mainstream historians have tended to emphasize consensus and inter-ethnic mixing in their interpretation of Russian colonization, continuing to focus on class, especially as the basis of conflict, while foreign historians and Buryat nationalist historians have tended to focus on inter-ethnic conflict and cultural assimilation, and have described Russian acquisition of territories around Lake Baikal as a bloody conquest. And some Buryat historians argue that Buryatia is still a colony of the Russian state. Even if we grant that the Buryats are in a colonial or a post-colonial relationship with the Russian state, the criteria of indigenous recognition as they have been established within Russian law leave out many groups, including Buryats, who would qualify as indigenous elsewhere. Thus, indigeneity remains a secondary way for peoples who might otherwise be called indigenous to claim rights and resources within Russia. Instead, current claims to land and mineral rights, as well as to financial resources supporting native language education and mass media, are based in Buryatia on an idiosyncratic set of principles and categories established during the Tsarist and Soviet periods. So Olga mentioned the numerically smaller, the indigenous small-numbered peoples of the North Siberia and the Far East, who've most successfully claimed oil and mineral rights within the framework of indigenous rights. And these are legally recognized groups who number under 50,000 and meet specific criteria, such as living in their historical territory, preserving traditional lifeways, and recognizing themselves as a separate ethnicity. The number alone precludes membership by groups like the Sakha and the Buryats on official grounds. I'm talking about the official criteria, who bore the status of powerful, well-developed titular nationalities during the Soviet period. Such groups could nonetheless call themselves indigenous, as the Sakha have done, as Olga outlined, by pointing to their history of colonization, structurally inferior political status, and long continuous occupation of the same territory. Yet, although the benefits of the status are not lost on many Buryats, for some it is also degrading to place themselves within the same sociocultural category as the Chukchi, the brunt of many racist jokes in the former Soviet Union. They point to the Buryats' glorious Mongol past as heroic warriors of the 13th century. As one proud man put it to me, "We Buryats were no forest tribe." Unfortunately, tracing your own history to Genghis Khan entails an acknowledgement that your ancestors were not only warriors, but conquerors, precluding claims to territorial firstness. And he was here implicitly contrasting Buryats with groups like the Evenks, who also have official status within Buryatia and make up about 0.3% of the population. So despite international paradigms of indigeneity that might treat Buryats and Evenks, for example, within the same framework, Buryats tend not to identify with Evenks on the basis of shared minority status. Moreover, the historical emphasis on territorial autonomy and titular nationalities has generated a territorial view of linguistic rights and of rights more generally that can exclude solidarity across regions. And I think Olga highlighted this as well. Within Buryatia and the Buryat diaspora, young cosmopolitan urbanites are the best acquainted with the paradigm of indigenous citizenship and the most likely to imagine their position as members of a global community of indigenous peoples, but they are also the least likely to fit its criteria of membership. Jessica Catalino has described a really similar double bind among the Florida Seminole in the US, who've grown wealthy through casinos and therefore cannot be recognized as indigenous by a state and a society that expect their indigenous population to be needy and dependent. Certainly, this expectation is at play to some extent in Russia, too. Some ethnic Russians and Buryats speak derisively of how the Sakha, supposedly dripping with diamonds and sending their children to expensive foreign universities, get special dispensation from the state. But Catalino's observations also point sideways to the negative possibilities of claiming an indigenous self-image when that self-image includes neediness, dependence, or degradation. In this light, even if a group has access to the cultural, linguistic, historical, and legal resources to claim indigenous status, it's not always clear that they would want to. So this is all to say that Buryatia is a primary example of the complexity that Olga was so poignantly pushing us to acknowledge as well, the heterogeneity and how the category of indigeneity is understood by and for indigenous or native groups. And this is something that Linda Tuhiwai-Smith argued passionately in work that's become classic for decolonizing anthropological methodologies, but it isn't exclusive to anthropology. And her observation was that we have to attend to the heterogeneity of viewpoints among members of a group and not treat peoples or individuals as though they are interchangeable. This is a crucial intervention too in recent approaches outside of anthropology. In sociolinguistics, for example, I would point to Cherise King's work and others on the heterogeneity of African-American vernacular English or Black vernacular English, showing that there's not just one, but many varieties of Black vernacular English spoken within the United States. So in sum, in public discourse in Buryatia, indigeneity is not the primary term of native belonging, and race is not assumed to be the main vector of social differentiation. Nevertheless, most non-Slavic people understand themselves as racialized within Russia without necessarily using the term, and Buryats are no exception. People treat phenotypic surfaces as opportunities for reading in complex social backgrounds. They engage in forms of racial guessing and racial profiling on a daily basis. And we can see this by considering how different actors are expected to control and perform the Buryat language in different ways. So my three examples will focus on language and on the media that reify expectations about how one speaks good Buryat, who speaks good Buryat, and thus who is a good Buryat. In my initial periods of ethnographic fieldwork, I learned Buryat with local tutors and lived with local families, but I really struggled to extend my social networks beyond well-educated elites. And then in 2009, I gave 2 interviews in Buryat for local television. So this is a screenshot from one of them. I don't know why it's in black and white. I don't seem to have a color copy. It wasn't like the 1940s. So strangers approached me for months to tell me about the big impression, the большое впечатление that it had made to hear Buryat from a girl of a European face, европейского лица. My pointed nose, my pointy nose, my creased eyelids and my freckles. You can't see my freckles, but I've got a pointy nose. Then we got a big nose. These became my most salient features. So long pointed European noses are the subject of racialized humor in Buryat. And Russians are often derogatorily called big-nosed, tomo hamarte or tomo noste. Kind of ironically using a Russian expression for nose in tomo noste. But the first time I was referred to, it's a slur, it's an ethnic slur, a racial slur. The first time I was referred to in this way by my friend's mother, my friend had to, it was like slightly barbed, my friend had to explain the joke. But you're very pretty, she quickly reassured me, only a little big-nosed. Whatever its true extent, my nose's televised grandeur granted me new access to people throughout Buryatia. After those broadcasts, I could arrive in a village unannounced and be recognized on the street and invited into people's homes. Because recorded broadcasts have long afterlives, I still hear second and third-hand reports of my linguistic prowess. Such reports are exaggerated. My nose granted me great latitude in people's estimation of my Buryat abilities, and my competence was persistently and generously overestimated, and continues to be, in fact. This morning, I said, late last night and this morning, I've been exchanging greetings with for the white month, for the Lunar New Year in Buryat. And so often somebody responds to me, like my friend's son, who just wrote me and said, oh, like, vi molodets, like, good job, because I said Happy New Year. I mean, it's very, very basic. The bar is low, is my point here, which is very relevant, actually, to thinking about the ways that racialization happens with and linguistic ability. So my competence is persistently and generously overestimated. In point of fact, there are quite a lot of, because in a way, the quality of my language isn't the point. The point is speaking Buryat at all shows my sincere interest and investment in Buryat affairs writ large, as long as I look like an outsider otherwise, right? So in point of fact, there are quite a lot of ethnic Russians racialized as white who can speak, or as European or Slavic, who can speak Buryat quite well. So why was this such a big deal? Many young people spoke to me and to each other of feeling a complex. And it was reflected in the way people of all ages reacted to those television broadcasts. How remarkable, they said, that a young person with a European face could speak Buryat on camera without a complex, без комплекса. When speakers of different generations talked about this, they referred to 2 different things. Older speakers usually referred to a feeling that many Buryats describe as having felt in the recent past, and sometimes still feel, that it is unseemly and low class to speak Russian poorly or with a Buryat accent. By contrast, many young people now have a strong complex about speaking Buryat poorly or with a Russian accent. And as a visually obvious outsider, I was free from both of those expectations, of course. So in contrast to how my facility with Buryat was treated, let us consider how individuals racialized as Buryat are expected to control Buryat through a second example. This story begins with a question. Why don't you know your own language? The first time I heard this expression, it was uttered by an elderly babushka, shaking her cane angrily at a young woman who stood in terrified silence like a deer in headlights, holding a tray of meat dumplings like these. Bozi, or boz, or bots, if you're more Mongolian. My friend Darima and I were in a cafe on the outskirts of Ulan-Ude. Two babushki, speaking Buryat, had tried repeatedly to order these boza from the two young women behind the counter. The girls had understood the order, or at least part of it, but they answered in Russian, to which the babushki replied in Buryat, to which the girls responded in Russian, until the babushki began shaking their heads and tisking with increasing frustration, whereupon the girls fell mute. My friend Darima, sitting opposite me at a creaky little table, clearly did not want to get involved, so she instinctively ducked her head, peeking over the top of her steaming mug of milky tea to watch. As the babushki's voices grew louder, a hushed silence fell over the cafe, everyone's attention trained on the frozen girls. They were practically in tears, eager to please their elders and running back and forth from the kitchen, but incapable of responding in Buryat. Finally, the girl holding the boats broke the silence by setting the tray down with a clatter, splashing some tea out onto this vinyl tablecloth and having to clean it up. And then the babushki began eating and chatting among themselves, and everyone returned to their own meals as though with a collective sigh of relief. So later, I had to ask Darima about the tension in the room and her own apparent fear of being approached by the elderly women. And she kind of giggled and she said, "Oh, Baboja, oh God," with a dismissive wave of her hand. "You know, it's really hard. It's really hard, you know, if you didn't grow up in the village and you don't speak it well. Yeah, and the babushki, you know, that's what they expect. They expect that you speak Buryat." And then she picked some lint off her blouse and became more sort of contemplative and frowned. And she said, "Well, and of course, we should. A person should speak their own language." And you know, later over the years, I have heard the same expression many times. So, for example, sitting with a television journalist, Sayana, she reviewed recordings of an interview in Buryat to be edited for the evening news. And in this interview she was recording or reviewing, there were a lot of ums and pauses, and the man being interviewed looked uncomfortable. He switched frequently into Russian, eventually pointing to his friend and suggesting that they interview him instead. And Sayana just sighed and tapped the screen with her pen, saying, "Why don't you know your own language?" So what does it mean to not know your own language? Because of Soviet and Russian policies that conflated native language with nationality and ethnicity, people who self-identify as Buryat will often identify Buryat as their own language, their svой язык, based on their broader ethnic self-affiliation, regardless of their linguistic competence. So the Russian Census Bureau has started distinguishing between native language and linguistic knowledge, or znania, which is helpful from a sociolinguistic data collecting standpoint, but it hasn't dramatically changed how people conflate ethnic belonging and linguistic expectations, at least not yet. Sayana extended the same expectation to someone whose self-identification she did not know, engaging in subtle racial guessing to conclude that he was Buryat and therefore rightfully should possess Buryat as his own language. The positive aspect of this is that she emphasizes the would-be speaker's ownership of a powerful identity marker. But the negative consequence is that she forces that identity onto him and demands a kind of knowledge that he does not share. As for knowing and not knowing, these are really variable attributions that shift with context. So Darima claimed that she had no knowledge of Buryat, even though I had witnessed her on many occasions carrying on bilingual conversations with her relatives, they speaking Buryat and she responding in Russian. Each family member assumed the other person had at least passive knowledge of both languages and spoke with his or her own language of preference, a pattern common in situations of long-term bilingualism, such as Ukraine. And in Ukraine, Lada Bilanyuk has called this non-accommodating bilingualism. It's fairly common, really common actually. There are many people like Darima and the girls at the cafe currently in their 20s and 30s who have excellent passive competence in Buryat, but cannot or will not speak. And others speak Buryat and are called upon to do so constantly because of these racial expectations. Others speak Buryat as a first language, but are more or less illiterate in the literary standard, or more rarely control the literary standard, but have little command of colloquial speech. And then there are still more who have little or no passive competence, but excellent knowledge of the pragmatic uses to which Buryat as a code may be put. So an onlooker in the cafe, for instance, might not understand what was being said in Buryat, but understand that the babushki intensified their scolding by conducting it in Buryat. Or that performing a toast in Buryat at a banquet demonstrates membership in a broader Buryat community. Although actually this guy was Soyot, so that's a separate conversation. One need not self-identify as a speaker of Buryat, in other words, to have some sort of knowledge about Buryat or to be taken as a speaker. So how are mass media implicated in this? Producing media in minoritized languages has long been seen by language rights activists as a commonsensical antidote to language endangerment and death, and by scholars of language politics as a symbolic gesture toward supporting minority political claims. But we don't actually have much data on how minority language media work. Few studies have traced how and why such media are actually created, circulated, and consumed. And because many Indigenous language media programs are relatively new post-colonial efforts, or they're part of private missionary efforts, few studies have been conducted in places where there has been long-term state support for producing native language media. In the Soviet Union and Russian Federation, many languages of Siberia, not only Buryat, but also Sakha, Evenki, Chukchi, and others, have been represented in print, radio, television, and emergent digital media over the past century, thanks to political and funding frameworks that are very different from those operative in Europe and the Americas. But this media production has still been insufficient to staunch the loss of native Siberian languages like Buryat. One of the reasons is that while mass media have successfully valorized the public performance of Buryat speech, they have also reified these ideas about who counts as a good speaker of Buryat. They heighten the shame and anxiety that would-be speakers like Darima feel when they are called upon to perform Buryat and fear that they either do not control Buryat or do not control the literary standard and therefore do not speak well. Darima's fear, I would say, derives from three interrelated sources of tension. First, both Buryats and members of wider Russian society generally expect individuals racialized as Buryat to be invested in the continuation of Buryat language and culture. And one of the main ways they are supposed to demonstrate their ethno-national belonging is through the public performance of good speech. These racialized expectations place a premium on knowing some Buryat, even if only a few words for symbolic use, like Sagan Har Sar. Second, a strong opposition between the literary standard and colloquial forms leads most people to understand language mixing, such as using Buryat grammatical endings on Russian origin terms, fundamentally as corruption, indicating a kind of misrecognition on the part of the speaker. So in the Soviet period, creating a strong literary standard from among diverse Buryat dialects was part of a grand project to modernize the Buryat language and thereby Buryats themselves. But as bilingualism in Russian grew and as the state increasingly pursued the development of Russian as a Soviet lingua franca, Buryat standardization efforts became more symbolic than substantive. And so today, media makers and other language elites nonetheless persist in trying to use the literary standard because it so strongly indexes modern nationhood and is the code of an idealized, unified Buryat minority public. But many people don't understand it. So consequently, contemporary audiences who control colloquial forms of Buryat have a hard time understanding Buryat language media, particularly news media, which further encourages them to default to Russian language sources and to remain silent when interviewers come knocking at the door. So third, individuals feel themselves to be more or less on stage in different contexts. So their sense of potential disaster is heightened by media contexts, which are generally framed as a space for Buryat language and culture to be presented as such, cordoned off from the much more syncretic and fluid linguistic and cultural practices of daily life. So radio and television interviews in particular are sites of public performance in which ideas about what it means to speak Buryat correctly become clear. And this brings me to my final example. Interviewees such as this one have to be cajoled by journalists into speaking Buryat on camera, and their speech is disfluent. So this doctor is trying to think about how to articulate something about syphilis in Buryat and coming up against the problem that she speaks about it exclusively in Russian most of the time. Contemporary native Siberians like the Buryats negotiate impossible expectations leveled by themselves and others. They're racialized within Russia as exotic Asians, but they're also supposed to be somehow European and quintessentially modern, a bridge for European Russians to a wilder East. So the core tension examined in the book that I'm drawing from here is that people expect local Buryat institutions such as newspapers to reaffirm Indigenous language and culture, and they genuinely do represent key means for negotiating Buryat belonging, but the forms they take are also assimilatory and hyper-institutional. So she only uses Russian in most of her medical life and her daily work life. And so these are some of the mixed messages that I'm referring to. Buryats are expected to perform cultural alterity without the resources to do so, which is impossible. I mean, on this point, it's clearly helpful to compare Buryat's position to that of the speakers or former speakers of indigenous languages in, for example, Mexico. So For instance, Shelley Muehlman, talking about Kukapa individuals in the Colorado River Delta, points out the impossibilities of being Indian in socially satisfying ways, or meeting shifting criteria for being Indian that now demand that they speak their language after years of being told not to speak and to speak Spanish instead. And I want to point out, as another comparison, that the burden of producing the minoritized language falls disproportionately on women. So it's no surprise that all the interactants that I've described in this brief talk are women. This is a common theme in research on language shift and revitalization, that the burden and expectation of linguistic and cultural reproduction falls to women and grandmothers. They're the locus of intergenerational transmission. The female doctor here was thrust into a role that she didn't want as a sort of unwilling interviewee after a male doctor whom the journalist approached based on his phenotype. He looked Buryat, said no. He said, no, it won't work out. So, and what I found in my research over and over again was this pattern of women protecting men from embarrassing themselves. So ultimately, language shift, uneven control of the standard, and racialized and gendered expectations of good public performance conspire to produce a kind of performance anxiety in people, what they often call a complex. This performance anxiety silences many would-be speakers of Buryat, excluding partial speakers or passive understanders, and people racialized as white or as European, and paradoxically furthering language loss, unfortunately. So in conclusion, I'd like to make an observation about how these racial categories might be becoming more rather than less reified in Russia as they are territorially reinscribed. Buryats living outside the Buryat territories, such as in sizable and multi-generational diasporas in Moscow and St. Petersburg, face significant xenophobia. Racial hate crimes have been perpetrated against Buryats based both on ignorant assumptions that they are foreigners, most often Chinese, and on generalized Slavic supremacism, even resulting in the murder of a young Buryat man on the streets of Moscow in 2007. Buryats living in Ulan-Ude often cite the xenophobia rampant in other parts of Russia as a reason to live in Buryatia or to move back home. So people I knew in Ulan-Ude in the late 2000s and early 2010s increasingly cited examples of friends or family members who were fleeing xenophobia in the urban capitals of Western Russia, or even in neighboring Irkutsk. This would be a great project for somebody, incidentally, which is there's great work being done on it right now too, but the sort of follow-up to see whether this is actually happening. And what the extent of sort of xenophobia motivated internal migration is. So this is a photo that I took in Baikalsk, an industrial town and ski area right outside the boundary of the Republic of Buryatia, saying Россия для русских, Russia for the ethnic Russians in Russian. Now this occasionally happens, and it's anathema to a regional identity that elevates visions of multicultural statehood over ethnic political autonomy. The graffiti also pushes against a tacit agreement operative in the Baikal region that Buryats will not demand more political autonomy as long as ethnic Russians refrain from being overtly nationalistic on Buryat territory, because it was like right outside the boundaries of the Republic. My argument here is not that Russians or Buryats are engaging in racism, though. Rather, I'm documenting that racialized expectations for linguistic and cultural performance infuse daily life in Russia, to suggest that these processes should be identified explicitly as such in our research. Hate crimes are clearly motivated by racism, but social science researchers are sometimes hesitant to use those terms in less immediately consequential cases because they're not emic. They're not used by people themselves. I've just within the past few minutes been advocating attending to more heterogeneity and exercising caution and assuming constancy in what indexical penumbra or range of meaningful associations people are invoking with categories of indigeneity. And indeed, applying these externally motivated categories of race and indigeneity, especially as an outsider, can be patronizing, and comparisons can sometimes be crude, to use Olga's term. At the same time, as she says, they can be illuminating, as we all have to do better. We all have to do better, I think, at highlighting similarities in the structural positions in which people find themselves marginalized and targeted, at worst through racially motivated hate crimes, and at best through unfair expectations of cultural alterity. Thanks.
Thank you very much for such rich and exciting and sometimes riveting presentations, Olga and Kate. So I wish we had more time to continue and not rush too much. I'm gonna try to keep my comments very brief, and if you decide to just respond very briefly, that's totally, please do so that we can have discussions with the audience. So both, I think this panel is great in many ways, but like just to mention one is that certain aspects of economic domination and exploitation and ambiguity that generates different kinds of engagement with the local communities are being complemented, I guess, from a different perspective, right? Linguistic, how language becomes a ways in which to talk about racialization, which always, unfortunately, mixed and accompanies colonialism. So while I was listening to both of you, I was thinking that a while ago, in 1996, I think, or even in about 1996, 1999, around that time, Jennifer Cole, who studied colonialism, memories of colonialism in Madagascar, wrote a book titled Forget Colonialism, and she put obviously the question mark. So, well, there is no such thing as forgetting colonialism when we are about to take as I think, Olga, did you note that post is no longer important, that we're going to take out post from post-colonialism? So thank you for giving that bringing us to these important points about colonialism and post, and how that's actually heavily present in the lives, and it's actually active in a new way. So first question to Olga is about ambiguity, right, as a tool for colonialism. And when I was listening to Uyandina and to Lena's stories, I was thinking about how different their experiences are and what to make out of these multiple temporalities and diversities in economic and political engagements, and the ways in which people not just don't have, as you noted, governments or parliaments as like people in the third world, but also have no ways in engaging into communal cohesiveness to begin with, and they're splintered as all these corporations enter in and take away their resources and channeling not only their resources away but also agencies away. All right. So what can we come up with in terms of adding to the existing theories of colonialism? And and one of the things I thought was the word ambiguity and blurring the distinction between colonizer and colonized. And it's not enough just to talk about agency, and agencies can be thwarted and turned into agency that actually serves the colonizer, as you know. So what can we say more about this? So by asking this question, I was also hoping that there is a way to address the part that you hadn't talked. Maybe that will reveal more about that. So I will stop here, because all these multiple temporalities and diversities of economic engagement seem to be so pervasive in your research, because in the previous, like earlier studies of post-colonialism and decolonization, for some reason, and I might be wrong, we have began also the notion of nation and nationalism always came up with it, the discourse of of bringing together the agencies against, obviously, the diversification and splintering of people, and transforming different kinds of colonizers and setting them into the local groups and things like that, which is mainly Ann Stoller's work, right? That the pervasive part of colonizer is that he or she doesn't think that they are colonizing and going on and things like that. But there is something else going on here when we have no discussion about the nation or nationalism. So for Kate, spectrality of race is quite profound. People don't invoke race or racism or even colonialism, and yet it's there. And I'm curious about the historical constitution of the ideology of the Soviets that is, I guess, trailing behind, or is so embedded that it's no longer even verbalized, meaning that the Soviet anti-racist, Soviet anti-racist in Western terms ideology was quite pervasive, partly because I guess the Cold War ideology of and socialist ideology of what? Of saving the people, of emancipating the Siberian people, of developing and civilizing these nations were developed very successfully in opposition to anti-colonial movements in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and parts of Africa. So the real colonizers were they, not the Soviets. The Soviets were actually against, and they were treating their minorities, so to speak, really well. So again, there is a question of agency to be anti-colonial, or at least to verbalize that, was taken away or not acknowledged. So I'm wondering, I know that you said that this is the kinds of linguistic exchanges that is taking place is not necessarily engagement in racism, both by the Buryats and by the Russians, but it's something else. But then would you like to say more about these mixed messages and how that is actually related to what it means to be Buryat a little more? Also, given the fact that the term Buryat has been contested. I don't know how it's contested with people whom you studied, but from some other parts of Buryats, there is a lot of discussion about who are the real Buryats and what languages of Buryats are actual Buryats and things like that. And I'm just wondering how that contributes to this spectrality of race that is not invoked and yet it's embodied.
Thank you, Manduhai. Would you like me to answer your question? Yes, thank you very much, Manduhai. This is quite a kind of like really complex question that you asked, because in a sense, what you've asked regarding post-colonialism, how we can actually deal with this kind of pervasiveness of coloniality, and so in a sense, here, basically, we are facing currently the world, this matrix of coloniality, out of which is very hard to get out, because in a sense, it is, as I said, all these ambiguities and kind of obscurities are being manipulated in order to precisely to ensure the hegemony lasts. So in a sense, and in the kind of pervasiveness precisely lies in this layers and layers that are part of this matrix. So what I was trying to show is that to a certain extent, indigeneity has been heavily criticized by certain scholars, but also I wanted to show the reality of the people actually on the ground who have to deal with this type of the political card, as I said, political category within which they have been pushed, so you're kind of pigeonholed within that particular population category. And the only card that is probably available for such people like we Indine is precisely this. The rest, for the rest of the other accessible categories, political categories, she doesn't have an access. So in a sense, what I was trying to show is that in a sense, on the one hand, how important it is for her to show her indigenous status in order to, I guess, to speak to that invisible international audience that could respond to her in a particular sense. Kind of, she's invoking this in order to generate a particular political response, maybe not among Sakha Russians, but among those, I guess, maybe Standing Rock water protectors. This is where they can find solidarity. And her fight for environmental justice, for social justice, in a sense, in that kind of a desire to seek the justice, and to although we can actually see that the matrix of coloniality would never allow her to reach this point, particularly with Putin on the top of this, of the entire hierarchy. So her, in a sense, her gesture, her action is hopeless. Yet what we see here is her basically something new, I guess, new political subjectivities emerging out of this environmental justice that we don't know yet what is happening. What I see as well here is that, and I see hope in that, is the hope in such movements as Standing Rock, Standing Rock water protectors, or Chetty Shakowin camp, that have been so pivotal, so profoundly impactful in precisely in the decolonial effort. I mean, because this is something that I see a new kind of political subjectivities coming out of these gestures of solidarity, political solidarity. And I'm sure we and Dean and Rachel would probably go and join the Standing Rock Dakota, Standing Rock protesters against Dakota Access Pipeline. So in a sense, in all that, I see something interesting happening. There is no yet kind of the semantic field that could actually, help us to pinpoint that emergent political subjectivity, including, indigeneity. Indigeneity is still an indigenous relationality. Indigenous subjectivity is still very much part of their reality. So in a sense, I wouldn't go and kind of cancel this particular semantic field completely, because it matters a lot, and yet in that particular fight for justice, there is something happening. So in a sense, and in this particular kind of actions, I see the kind of the seeds of decolonization. And because in a sense, post-colonial theory has kind of has not been, let's say, satisfying enough, in precisely because it hasn't captured this anti-colonial protests like Standing Rock, and I see in that Standing Rock protests, or Chetty Shakowin, water protectors, indigenous protectors, indigenous matriarchs protests. They're really potent. We don't know what is happening, but something is happening out there. Yeah, sorry. That's
Thank you. I will just respond with one sentence that there is something about, as you say, new in political subjectivity, which to me, it seems it might be too idealizing and too idealistic. You said we don't know what the results will be, and there will probably no results for Uyandina, but there might be results with Standing Rock, right? So this kind of sending off the victory somewhere else. But actions here, and that's what it matters at the moment, seems to be also some form of political subjectivity to me. So
I think can we end with a question from Craig Campbell that perhaps Olga will still have a chance to respond to. He asks, in a recent article by LNR, because this follows directly on this point, in a recent article by LNR Sulyan Ziga, writes, the current indigenous policy in Russia, seemingly aimed at the conservation of indigenous cultures, ignores the actual challenge indigenous peoples face, survival at a sheer physical level, and is doomed to failure, end quote. In what ways does this, in many ways, this seems like a powerful lesson learned from corporate industrial greenwashing perfected since the last 60 years. What are the most successful forms of action for indigenous Northerners in Russia that you have witnessed, and what, if anything, gives you hope in these dark times? I mean, possibly it sounds like it's pushing.
Yes.
Moving it off to future
right.
for future possibilities.
Yeah. No, I haven't seen anything yet that would even be closer to Standing Rock. Precisely because the reality that indigenous group populations face now, any attempt, any sort of move to go for an open protest will be suppressed straight away. And what we see, what is happening now, particularly with Navalny in Moscow, this is what we precisely see. The entire police would come out and will suppress and push you in the prison. So in a sense, it doesn't mean that this type of violence hasn't happened in Standing Rock during Standing Rock protests. That people were literally crushed by the bulldozers, and trucks. What I so in a sense, my answer is nothing has happened yet. There were maybe spontaneous protests, just like we indigenous protests, but nobody knows about them. Nobody actually, they don't have this kind of media culture that would go into this remote Arctic corner where with one woman with the placard standing and protesting against the mining industry. So nothing of this type of media response, as in Standing Rock case, would happen and is possible in Russia. So at least to a certain extent here, we can actually see the importance of media communication, all these technologies, Facebook, Twitter, everything that has been so pivotal for expanding the impact of Standing Rock protests. Nothing like this is possible in Russia, particularly in Siberia, precisely because there is no internet, connection. So she was there completely on her own, and probably she was there. I mean, I completely admire her courage and that kind of silence and invisibility. This is something that she faces every day. And for her, it wasn't surprising, yet she went for the protests. So I guess this is my kind of, question, answer.
Kate, you want to respond further before? Did you say you need to leave?
I do need to leave soon. I thought you did such a lovely job, Manduhai. Thank you for those comments of pinpointing that it is a Cold War discourse that created this situation of it's the long legacy of Cold War discourses that creates this kind of racial spectrality in Russia and makes it so difficult for people to sort of overtly talk about processes of racialization. Racial questions sort of should come up in discussions about who constitutes a real Buryat, but they're often still sort of subliminal or secondary. Like, features will be specific, facial features will be like described, but it's not foregrounded in as race, because again, that remains a problem that we're supposed to have in the United States, and that Russia somehow magically has avoided. And I suspect I'll be very curious to hear the panel on the reception of Black Lives Matter in Russia, because to date it has not resulted in very much introspection on the part of a lot of people in Russia that you'd expect to have maybe benefit from introspection. Actually, it's still not seen. The Black Lives Matter movement and sort of problems of racial inequality are not seen as possibly Russian problems. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess this also speaks a little bit to a question posed by Kenneth Linden, who also asked about different kinds of, racism of back and forth, right? Anti-other Siberian people, and how is it linguistic, visual, historical, and things like that. So you touch upon that. If you want to add to that.
A lot of that is humor, right? So a lot of jokes, like calling Russians big noses and then kind of laughing about it. I mean, there's always a grain of truth in any sort of stereotype, and there's a grain of truth in any grain of sort of barb in any joke like that. So a lot of it is humor. The graffiti example, I think, is a one of many examples I could have given of when it becomes painful, because if something is brought to the surface that isn't usually is usually sort of sublimated. And this question about Kenneth Linden's last question is there a crossover with racism against, say, Chinese people, or is it a separate phenomenon? Yeah, anti-Chinese racism in Russia is another really wonderful topic. I mean, it's a terrible phenomenon, but it's a wonderful topic. And it's fascinating how different and how much more poignant in some ways anti-Chinese racism is, xenophobia towards the Chinese is in Buryatia and in the Baikal territory, specifically because Buryats are so often misidentified as Chinese and the target of xenophobia by ethnic Russians who see them as foreigners and try to exclude them and even murder them in some cases on those grounds. So that's this is an example of how racist hatred begets racist hatred. Like it's hard to not try to protect yourself when there are these grounds of misrecognition.
Yeah. So thank you so much for these fabulous papers and great discussion. Very difficult topics in some ways, and I'm left with lots of thoughts and critical understanding of what is going on in Siberian Arctic, in Siberia, among the people whom I studied across the border previously, but with a different kinds of questions. So it's been a great panel, and I really appreciate your presentations. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This was really a pleasure.
Thank you, Manduhai. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you all for questions.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for coming to the panel. So we might see you during next one.